Think back to the later days of April. Those days in which a massive leak revealed significant plot details about The Last of Us Part 2. When word began to spread that not only would Joel meet his fate at the hands of a woman with a golf club, but that same game would shift to her perspective halfway through, chaos ensued on the internet as anger clashed with the interest of Naughty Dog and Sony, whom took major strides to erase the content from the face of the internet. When June came around, the embargo for The Last of Us Part 2 released to universal acclaim from gaming journalists. Yet the sentiment from gaming journalists stood in extreme contrast to the reaction of the public. At one point, there was a disparity exceeding 60 points between the critic and user scores on Metacritic, and while that user score is significantly higher now than it was before, the difference remains astounding. The argument can be made that a significant portion of the online complaints against The Last of Us Part 2 arose from people who did not play the game at first. Yes, there are people who cannot get over the fact that Abby's muscular due to preconceived notions, and there are people that are writing off the entirety of this game despite their issues focused on the story. Regardless, there is still something unsettling about the game's release that has not been highlighted with the same vigor. Something that has preceded The Last of Us Part 2's release for several years that played an undeniable role in the outrage that came with it. More specifically, it was not The Last of Us Part 2 itself that is the greatest cause for concern. Rather, it was the perception of The Last of Us Part 2 prior to its release that hurt this game's reputation, which Naughty Dog themselves were largely responsible for. As we look back to the game's pre-release cycle, I believe it will become more clear what the true mistake of The Last of Us Part 2 really is. If you've been playing video games for a while, you probably know that games can change between announcement and release. Examples of this can be minor, such as graphical improvements, interface adjustments, or gameplay changes. In rare cases, games can morph from one state to another, as was the case of Final Fantasy Versus 13 when it became Final Fantasy 15. Because the nature of game development is complex, it is unfair to expect a game to be the exact same state as it was months or years prior. Therefore, many gamers consider how a game might be changed when setting their expectations. Giving the benefit of the doubt is commonplace for gaming enthusiasts because there is inherent consideration for how difficult making a game can be. However, there is an underlying trust that a game's pre-release marketing and PR reflect the state of the game at that point in time. When we saw The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild in 2014, players trusted that the game would be an open-world experience that pushed Zelda into new territories. The game arguably looked better in 2014 to some, and there were features that failed to make it into the final product, particularly the Wii U version, but that didn't matter in the end because the game delivered upon its promises and garnered a well-deserved reputation as one of the greatest video games of the decade. Meanwhile, something like Anthem got slammed for failing to live up to the expectations that it established with a lavish gameplay reveal that stood in contrast to a game that released in a broken state. The main idea is that there is a sense of social responsibility from game developers and publishers to represent their products as accurately as possible, especially when it requires consumers to pay a price of admission. And when there is a disconnect between these two parties, the results can be damning. Unfortunately, The Last of Us Part 2 fell into this trap. At this point, you might have seen a few videos comparing the differences between the game's trailers and the game's actual footage. The trailers often showed an older Joel that reflected his current appearance, but playing the game reveals it was a body swap to obscure that those scenes were flashbacks. The most notable instance, however, has Joel taking the place of Jesse to give the impression that Joel would be along for the ride. All of this was done in order to conceal that Joel died within the first couple hours of the game. But what exactly does that even mean? I had never asked myself this question before, but how do you use a trailer to hide something if that information could neither be confirmed nor disconfirmed? Unless the leak had happened, for all we know, Joel could have spent most of the game playing a few rounds of miniature golf in the calm confines of Jackson, Wyoming, or scouring the world with Ellie on her revenge quest. Here's where the framing of the situation changes, however. Instead of Naughty Dog hiding Joel's death, they wanted to prevent speculation of the event altogether. When The Last of Us Part 2 was revealed at PSX 2016, fan theories began to emerge that Joel might have been dead in the sequel, and that his presence in that first trailer was a figment of Ellie's imagination. For the years following that, there was reassurance that The Last of Us Part 2 was still Joel's and Ellie's story. There is brief mention of him in the 2018 E3 trailer after that, but he fails to make a physical appearance until September of 2019, when they revealed the first release date of February 2020. With Joel making a definitive appearance in the trailer, all speculation of Joel's death from that point forward was put to rest. I mean, we see him cover Ellie's mouth to stop her from alerting the WLF. That has to be him, right? Oh wait, it's Jesse. Wait, hey Jesse. After all this is over, maybe we can go get a drink or something? God, to show how this can be frustrating, I'm going to create a hypothetical that spoils something in Xenoblade Chronicles, so skip to this timestamp if you want to avoid it. So as players of Xenoblade Chronicles know, Fiora appears to die after the attack on Colony 9. However, it is later revealed that she is alive and that most of her body was replaced with that of a Mechon. And after a bunch of story events play out later, she eventually becomes the 7th playable character. Now, pretend that there were trailers that showed late-game footage of Shulk and Fiora, such as this pivotal cutscene right here, except that Fiora's current model is swapped out with her original one. That would imply a couple of things to the viewer. First, that Fiora didn't get gravely wounded, and perhaps more importantly, that she accompanies Shulk on his journey to get revenge on the Mechon. And if the trailers had portrayed the game like this, it would certainly qualify as misleading. Speaking of expectations, it might be time to address the elephant in the room, Abby. To Naughty Dog's credit, the game plan for hiding her status as a playable character was pretty clever when looking back at 2017. We got a Paris Games Week trailer featuring Yara and Lev in a dire situation with the Seraphites. The reason I blurred her name out was because we didn't actually know it at the time. We knew a grand total of 3 things about her. 1, she was a character. 2, she was played by Laura Bailey. 3, she's pretty strong. No one was obligated to disclose her role in the story at that point. That trailer was suffice enough to show players that The Last of Us Part 2 would be a much larger tale than we anticipated. It is also well known that the review embargo prevented critics from even talking about her. Given that her narrative constitutes a large portion of the game, it rivals the death of Joel as the biggest twist The Last of Us Part 2 has to offer. While I cannot fathom how one could adequately review the game without referencing its latter sections, it raises interesting questions about what content is acceptable to censor without withholding critical information that might influence someone's purchasing decision. In the case of Abby, I would be hard-pressed to criticize Naughty Dog for wanting to conceal her from the public. If it is not because it is the biggest risk the game took, it is in respect for the ability of the creators to tell the story in the way they wanted to tell it. All that the studio would need to do to ensure that is make sure that it didn't put the faith of its players in jeopardy. Except that it did. On June 14th of 2018, a reporter from IGN asked Neil Druckmann and Richard Combier if there would be other playable characters in The Last of Us Part 2. At first, Combier said, quote, "We aren't saying anything about that yet," end quote. And while a generic answer, it is an acceptable one knowing what they attempted to hide. However, Druckmann decided to step in. Quote, "Ellie is the only playable character in the game," end quote. What's so confusing about this answer was that Combier had already given a proper response, but because Druckmann wanted to stop speculation on that point, he lied. something that he even admitted to after the game's release. Combine that with the trailer altercations discussed earlier, and you've got a recipe for disaster in the public discourse. Some might speculate that Abby's role in the game was not established at that point, but given that she showed up in a 2017 trailer, and given the nature of the final product, it is safe to assume this was not the case. Had there not been such a deliberate effort to concoct a certain perception about the course that The Last of Us Part 2's story would take, it would stand to reason that fans might be more open-minded. As I wrote this script, I kept thinking back to the phenomenal ending of The Last of Us. After Joel lies to Ellie that he told the entire truth about the events in St. Mary's Hospital, the subtle trepidation and skepticism of Ellie can be read in her eyes. Given that Joel did so much for her, and they traveled so far together to reach their destination, she doesn't want to believe his words are not sincere. So after a period of hesitation, she chooses to trust him. Looking back on it now, I couldn't help but envision Naughty Dog and the fans standing in for Joel and Ellie respectively. The Last of Us Part 2 was a game tainted from deceptive marketing, false assumptions, and overwhelming expectations. It sparked an extreme outcry where genuine concerns from some became meshed with abhorrent rhetoric from others. And while I do believe the actions of Naughty Dog to protect the story were purely driven to do as such, the tactics used were arguably unethical. The game has proceeded to become a commercial success, but at the cost of a fractured trust with one of the most talented game developers in the world. Just like what happens when Joel unearths the dark secret he kept from Ellie for so long. Yet after enough time has passed, Ellie shows that she wanted to try and reforge that lost connection.
I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. But I would like to try.
And just like her, and perhaps many others, I find it hard to forgive Naughty Dog for misleading me about the game for multiple years. That is the true mistake of The Last of Us Part 2, but it's a mistake I will try to forgive. So that's about it. There's a lot to The Last of Us Part 2 that I could discuss in more detail, but other content creators out there have done a fantastic job of dissecting this game from multiple perspectives, so I implore you to check out their content if you get the chance. And for those who watched this video until the very end, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to do so. This is the first video on my channel, and I would seriously love to continue doing more videos like this pertaining to things that I'm interested in, whether it be gaming or animation or film. And I will always be looking for suggestions and feedback on everything I do, whether it be positive or negative. So please feel free to leave comments if that suits your fancy. And in the typical YouTube shtick, I'd really appreciate it if you could support this video by liking it and maybe subscribing to my channel if you want to see more content from me. That's all I have. Thank you once again, and I will see you all in the next video.